They say a widow stumbled out of the forest carrying 3 newborns, her face battered, her spirit nearly gone. Folks say her husband's kin tried to bury her shame and the babies with her, but what nobody expected was the mountain man. He hadn't spoken to a soul in years, yet when he found her, half frozen beneath pine and snow, something broke open in him. He took her in, fought for her, declared, "I will be their father." But who was this man, and what past was he hiding behind that cabin door? When a recluse opens his door to the broken, and a town chooses sides, one question echoes through the hills. Who found family that day, and who nearly lost their soul? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how these stories aren't just fiction, they're reflections of the values we still hold dear. If you believe in second chances, quiet bravery, and the power of choosing love over fear, then you're part of this story too. Let me know which state you're watching from, and subscribe to help us keep telling stories that bring hope back to the frontier. Snow fell in slow, deliberate sheets, the kind that muffled sound and made even cruelty seem quiet. Clara Mayfield clutched the rough wool blanket tighter around her 3 newborns, each bundled against her chest and sides, their tiny cries no louder than the wind through the pines. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen near shut. Blood had dried along her temple where the edge of a boot had found her, and her lip bore the split of a ringed hand swung in judgment. Behind her, the gates of the Mayfield estate, grand and cold as the men who ruled it, remained shut. No one had followed her. No one would. The snow came quicker now, swirling like a curtain being drawn. Each step was agony, her legs numb and shaking from the birth just 2 nights past, her feet bare inside worn slippers that had once been her mother's. The babies whimpered, hungry, confused, alive. She whispered each of their names like a prayer: Hope, Elias, Mercy, 3 names she had chosen in secret, never allowed to speak aloud under the roof of her late husband's kin. "You brought shame," they'd spat. 3 mouths born to a dead man. God has judged you. She hadn't screamed when they dragged her from the birthing bed. She hadn't fought when they stripped her of her dowry and tossed her into the snow. But she did beg for the babies. Just let her take them. And when they laughed, when Roy Mayfield raised his hand again, something in her had risen, raw and unbroken. She'd taken them, wrapped them, and walked out into the cold. The forest loomed now, darker and deeper than she'd ever dared venture. Somewhere behind her, the town of Fetters Hollow gossiped over coffee, church bells ringing hollow. She knew what they'd say. That she'd snapped. That sorrow made her mad. That a woman alone with triplets in the Montana winter was as good as gone. Still, she kept walking. Night pressed in like a weight. Her breath came in shallow pants, the warmth of her body feeding the infants even as it drained from her limbs. Snow crusted in her hair, her lashes, her sleeves. She sang softly, just fragments of lullabies from her childhood, words slurred and broken by cold and pain. One baby cried out louder, and she kissed its head, willing her own heartbeat to keep going just long enough. Branches scratched her arms as she pushed through the underbrush, and at last she reached a clearing. There, distant and dim, was a flicker of orange firelight maybe, or the hallucination of one. A cabin stood at the edge of the trees, half swallowed by snow. Smoke curled faintly from its chimney. She stumbled once, catching herself before falling over the infants. Then again, her legs collapsed under her. This time, she didn't rise. Her head hit the snow, and the baby's cries became the only sound in the wilderness. Inside the cabin, the man paused. He had been carving a strip of cedar by lantern light, hands calloused and slow. His dog, a scarred old mutt, lifted its head and growled low. The man stood, setting his knife down. Outside, the wind howled, but beneath it, he heard something else. A baby's cry, then another, and another. Fetters Hollow was the kind of town where news didn't travel, it lingered, curling around fences, drifting through lace curtains, settling in rocking chairs like smoke from a fire never quite put out. It wasn't long after Clara Mayfield vanished into the storm that tongues began to wag. First in the church vestibule, then at the general store, and finally where all real truth fermented on the porch of Miss Tilly's boarding house. "They say she went north," muttered old Jasper, scratching his beard. into the pines. North? Miss Tilly echoed, folding linens with the solemnity of a funeral parlor. Ain't nothing up there but that man. The words hung in the air like frost. The man. Children knew his name only in whispers. The mountain man, the bear man, sometimes simply him. Parents warned of his cabin near Dead Horse Ridge, saying he once lived in town before the war, before the fire, before whatever happened turned his soul black. No one could say for sure. Some claimed he'd killed a man with his bare hands. Others swore he spoke to ghosts. Every few winters, a trapper might report seeing smoke from a hidden chimney. One boy had even dared venture to the edge of the woods. He came back pale and shaking, said he saw eyes like lantern glass watching from behind a tree. But no one had seen him up close in nearly a decade. Still, Clara Mayfield had gone that way. And the town, in its curious, cowardly way, began to wonder why. She was always a quiet one, said the preacher's wife, clucking her tongue. Never fit into the Mayfield brood. Didn't wear color after the funeral. Didn't mourn right. 3 babies, all at once, said Mr. Colby, shaking his head at the barber shop. Nature don't give like that without taking something else. So they speculated, quietly and safely. None dared ride out after her, though a few pretended to try. Sheriff Donnelly made a show of checking the west trail before turning back at the fork. The snow was too thick, he said. No use risking horses for a woman who'd walked willingly into her fate. But fate hadn't guided Clara. Instinct had. The kind buried deep in the bones of women who've suffered enough to know that no man, not husband, not sheriff, not preacher, was coming to save her. Her lips were cracked, cheeks raw and red with windburn. Each step now felt like walking through glass. Still, she clung to her babies like roots to soil. She didn't know how many miles she'd gone, only that the night was growing darker, and the light she'd glimpsed through the trees had vanished again, like a dream receding. Branches clawed her dress. She paused to rest, crouching behind a drift, shifting the infants against her skin to keep them warm. One had stopped crying. She shook them gently, whispering, humming whatever sounds her throat could muster. Her eyes scanned the woods, glazed with fatigue. Then a sound, a creak like a door, faint footsteps in snow. She turned toward it, heart pounding, and from the tree line, something emerged, not beast, not man, but a silhouette large and still as stone. She could no longer tell if she should fear it or beg it for mercy. The wind had turned cruel by the time Clara's knees buckled in the snow. Her breath was shallow, her arms limp where they'd once clutched the 3 tiny bundles now barely stirring against her chest. One final step, then the world tilted. Her body hit the frozen ground with a thud muffled by snow, and her eyes, wide and vacant, stared toward the trees as if trying to remember something she'd never been told. The forest watched, silent and unsentimental. Then, slowly, a cabin door creaked open. Elias Stone stood in the doorway, a rifle slung across his back, though he hadn't raised it. He stared out into the dark with eyes honed from years of watching predators. Something had come into his woods. He'd felt it before he'd heard it. The cry of the babes had woken the dog first, an old mutt named Thorn who only barked when something unfamiliar breached the edges of their solitude. But this cry had been different. Not danger, not hunger, desperation. He moved down the steps in silence, his boots crunching through untouched snow. The wind hissed through the trees, trying to bury what lay there before anyone might see. Then he saw her, a woman, face down, bare hands, frozen stiff in fists, and 3 infants, God in heaven, there were 3, tucked against her, breath ghosting weak from blue-tinged mouths. The woman's skin was pale as moonlight, lips cracked, a bruise blooming purple across her temple. Elias froze. Something deep inside his chest pulsed, a thing long silent now stirring. A woman in the snow, children, too small to survive. His hands trembled not from cold, but memory. He should turn back. He should let the forest take them. The last time he'd opened his door to the world, it had burned everything he loved to ash. But still he stood there, watching, listening. The wind bit harder now, like teeth. One of the babies gave a thin, warbling cry. That did it. With swift, sure movements, Elias knelt and scooped them up babies first, bundled close inside his coat. The woman he lifted last, her weight light, too light, as if she'd been carved from hollow wood. He kicked the cabin door open with one boot and laid them all by the hearth. Thorn whined, circling, sniffing. Elias barked a command, and the dog lay down. The fire was burning low, but he fed it fast, tossing cedar and pine until the flames roared. He stripped the woman's soaked shawl and began drying the babies with a wool shirt pulled from his trunk. They were impossibly small, faces red and pinched, but alive, 2 girls and a boy, by the looks of them. He wrapped each in flannel, placed them near the hearth, then turned to her. She was younger than he'd thought, no more than 23, maybe 25. Dirt and blood streaked her face. Her boots were mismatched, one laced with twine. She'd come far, farther than most ever dared. Elias pulled up a chair and sat beside her, arms crossed over his chest, heart thudding slow but hard. He didn't touch her again, just watched, listened, waited. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin like a wolf circling its prey. Inside, the fire cracked, the babies whimpered, and the man who hadn't spoken aloud in years muttered just once, under his breath, "Lord, help me." For 3 days, the cabin stood silent but for the crackle of firewood, the soft creak of floorboards, and the restless murmurs of newborn breath. Elias Stone moved with quiet purpose, the way a man does when he's lived long with his own ghosts. He stoked the fire, boiled water, cleaned wounds. He mashed boiled oats with goat's milk and fed the babies drop by drop, using a carved spoon and a quiet patience bred from long solitude. He changed cloths, washed linens, wiped fever from a stranger's brow, and all the while, he never spoke a word. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes moaning, sometimes still as death. When her fever peaked, Elias cooled her with snow-packed cloths. When she shivered, he tucked furs around her shoulders. The babies lay near the fire in a cedar-lined crate padded with wool, never more than an arm's reach away. He'd carved it himself years ago, though until now it had held only tools and spare kindling. He slept in the corner, boots on, rifle nearby. He didn't trust the silence, not in the forest, not in the woman. But still, he stayed. On the morning of the 4th day, Clara opened her eyes. Not halfway, not in fevered flickers, but fully, clearly. She blinked at the ceiling, then turned her head toward the fire. Her body tensed, instinctive panic rippling through her. She tried to sit up and cried out as pain bloomed in her side. Elias didn't move from the hearth where he was stirring a pot, but he turned his head just slightly. Their eyes met. She gasped, scrambling backward across the cot, dragging the blanket with her. Where are they?" Her voice cracked with dryness. He pointed with one hand, slow and steady, to the makeshift cradle. The babies lay bundled and breathing. She looked at them, then at him, then around the room. It was a simple cabin stone hearth, wood stove, shelves lined with jars and tin. It smelled of cedar and smoke. Her breath came fast. "Don't hurt me," she said. Elias blinked, then shook his head. She stared at him. "You're the man they talk about, the one in the ridge." He didn't answer, just ladled warm broth into a tin cup and set it on the stool beside her. Then he walked away. She watched him go, uncertain. She sipped the broth, hands trembling, then turned her attention to the babies. She counted them again, 3, all alive, all warm. Later, when the sun crept pale through the frost-glazed window, she lifted the smallest child to her chest and whispered, "Her name's Mercy." Then the next, "This one's Hope." And the boy, quietest of the 3, Elias, she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. The mountain man paused where he stood near the door, just a flicker of reaction in the stillness. Then he moved again, out into the snow, axe in hand. He didn't say a word, but she noticed when he came back an hour later, he had fresh firewood, warm milk in a clay jug, and a new fur stitched from an old coat. And when he passed the cradle that night, he lingered just long enough to adjust the smallest baby's blanket. The days slipped by like thawing snow, slow but sure. Clara's strength returned not in leaps, but in inches. First, her breath no longer rasped, then her fingers stopped trembling. Elias watched without intrusion, always close but never looming. He'd built a rhythm into their quiet, wordless life. He brought water from the creek, chopped firewood before dawn, milked the goat, and fed the babies with his weathered hands. In the beginning, he'd place everything near her: warm broth, boiled roots, clean cloth, and retreat like a shadow. But now, as spring light began to edge through the frost-laced windows, something softer had begun to bloom between them. One morning, Clara sat up by herself. Her hand reached for the cabin wall as she slid from the cot. Her legs shook beneath her, but she gritted her teeth and took a step. Elias stood nearby, arms crossed, watching. She caught his eye, half expecting him to stop her, to shake his head, to do anything but what he did: wait. When she stumbled, he reached out just enough for her to catch her balance against his forearm. She leaned there, panting. He didn't move. "I need to stand," she said, voice barely more than a whisper. He gave a slow nod. They stood there in silence, her fingers pressed into his sleeve, his boots planted steady on the wooden floor. Then, slowly, she took another step. He walked beside her, silent as ever, and helped her back to the cot only when her knees finally buckled. But neither spoke of it. That afternoon, she insisted on stirring the fire herself. Elias watched from the corner, cleaning his rifle. When she dropped the poker and cursed under her breath, he made no move to help. Instead, he waited, letting her try again. She did, and when the flames rose, casting her face in gold, he said his first word since the night he brought her in. "Good." The word surprised them both. She turned to look at him, eyes wide with something more than fatigue. Gratitude, maybe even peace. He returned to his work, but from that day forward, he spoke in fragments, quiet affirmations, simple truths. "Milk's warm. Storm coming. You rest." They began to share the space, like two people learning to breathe in sync. Clara took to mending clothes with spare thread, humming lullabies as the babies gurgled nearby. Elias, moved by some old skill he'd nearly forgotten, carved a new cradle from pine logs. He worked late into the night, sanding the edges until they were smooth as glass, inlaid the names Clara had spoken softly over each child: Hope, Mercy, Elias. The first time the boy laughed, it happened as Elias held him near the window to show him the falling snow. The sound, light and pure, cut through the silence like spring water down stone. Elias froze. The baby laughed again, kicking his feet, and Elias let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Clara turned at the sound and saw the impossible, a flicker of a smile on Elias Stone's weathered face. She said nothing of it, only returned to folding clothes by the fire. But that night, as the wind curled around the cabin and the fire burned low, she whispered to the sleeping children, "I think he's coming back." The snow had begun to retreat from the cabin's edges, revealing patches of brown earth and stone. Spring was still shy, but it had whispered a promise through the pines. Inside, life had taken on a rhythm that bordered on peace. The fire no longer burned out overnight. The babies slept longer stretches, and Clara could now walk the length of the cabin unassisted, her arms full of laundry or wood. Elias had spoken more often, short, blunt sentences, but she noticed the weight in each one, the way he chose words like tools, precise, necessary, no more. Yet even as the days softened, shadows clung to him like fog around the ridge. Clara began to notice them small things at first, the way he tensed when one of the babies cried too sharply, especially Mercy, the way he left the room when Clara hummed certain lullabies, as though they were knives carving old scars. He'd stare at the fire sometimes like he was watching something far beyond it, something lost and unreachable. One afternoon, while folding linens by the bed, Clara knocked over a small wooden box tucked beneath the edge of Elias's cot. It split open on the floor, scattering buttons, a broken watch, and a thin, worn photograph. She froze. The image was yellowed with age, its corners curled. It showed a woman with soft eyes holding a little girl no more than 3. The child's curls were tied with a ribbon. Both were smiling, happy, whole. Clara reached for it, fingers trembling slightly, when the door creaked. Elias stood there, a bundle of chopped kindling in his arms. His eyes landed on the photo and then on her. He didn't speak. He didn't move. The silence between them deepened, sharpened. "I'm sorry," Clara said, holding the photo gently, like it might break just from being remembered. He took a breath, slow and ragged. "Put it back." She nodded and did. He turned and left without another word. That night, the cabin felt colder despite the fire. Elias had not returned for supper. Clara fed the babies alone, her ears tuned to every creak and groan of the old wood. When the moon climbed high, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The woods whispered. She followed the faint trail he always took at dusk, a path that wove past the goat pen and through a thicket of pine. A ways down, beneath a lone cedar tree, she found him. He was on his knees, head bowed, hat in his lap. Before him stood 2 wooden markers driven deep into the earth. No names carved, no dates, just stones and silence. His shoulders trembled. She stayed at a distance, watching the way his hand reached out to touch one marker, then dropped as though even that was too much. She didn't speak. After a while, he said, voice hoarse, barely above the wind, "The fire took them. My wife, my daughter." Clara's heart cracked in her chest. She stepped forward once, then stopped. Still, she didn't speak. "I was away, trapping. Came back to ashes." He pressed his forehead to the dirt. "I never built another fire for years after that. Thought I'd burn anything I touched." Clara knelt slowly beside him, her hand finding his. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't offer comfort in words. Instead, she sat with him in the dark, letting the night witness what he could no longer hide. In silence, 2 broken hearts knelt side by side among the graves, and something in the earth began to thaw. The snow melted slowly that year, as if reluctant to give up its hold on the mountain. But beneath it, life stirred. Mud replaced frost. Icicles dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves. The ground, hardened by months of cold, began to soften in patches where the sun lingered longest. It was on one such morning that Clara stepped outside, cradling Mercy in a sling across her chest, and knelt at the edge of the clearing behind the cabin. She scraped away the snow with a flat piece of bark, revealing the cold, damp soil beneath. Her breath came in little clouds, but the sun warmed her shoulders. Her hands, still calloused from weeks of work, dug with quiet determination. She cleared a small square of earth, nothing grand, just enough to start something. When Elias emerged from the tree line with an armful of firewood and saw her, he paused. She looked up but didn't say anything. Instead, she returned to her task, her movements slow and steady. A moment passed, then another, and without a word, Elias set down the wood, walked over, and began clearing beside her. Together they worked in silence, shoulder to shoulder, their shadows falling long behind them. The babies lay in a basket nearby, swaddled and content beneath a wool blanket. Clara occasionally glanced over to check on them, and each time her eyes softened. Elias noticed. Later, from a dusty trunk inside the cabin, Clara pulled out a cloth bundle seeds she'd brought from town long ago, ones meant for a garden she never got to plant. She held them out to Elias. He took the packet gently, turned it over in his calloused hands, and nodded. The next day, they planted rows of beans, carrots, and squash, fingers pressing each seed into the earth like a prayer. Elias built a rough fence from branches to keep the deer away. Clara marked each row with a carved stick. It was simple work, but it was theirs. Inside the cabin, warmth came not only from the fire but from what surrounded it. Clara began reading aloud in the evenings passages from an old Bible and from a worn book of poems left behind by whoever had once lived in the cabin before Elias. She'd sit in the rocking chair, the triplets bundled in her lap, her voice low and rhythmic. Elias would whittle at the table, carving scraps of cedar into simple shapes. A bird, a little fox, a ringed teether. His fingers remembered the work, even if his heart had once forgotten why it mattered. The babies began smiling more. Hope giggled when Elias made a face at her across the cradle. Mercy clutched at his finger and refused to let go. Little Elias cooed when the mountain man lifted him near the window, showing him the first buds on the trees. The silence that had once been a shield between them now became a comfort. They didn't need many words. Their days were full with the sound of breathing, of wind in the trees, of the slow, healing hush that comes when broken things begin to mend. And in the evenings, when the sky turned amber and the shadows stretched long over the garden soil, Clara would sometimes catch Elias staring not at the fire but at the three children, and at her. He never smiled wide, but something in his eyes was brighter, less burdened, as if, slowly, something buried long ago was beginning to bloom. The air smelled of thawing pine and turned soil. The sky stretched wide and cloudless above the ridge, soft blue interrupted only by the whisper of distant hawks circling. Spring had come, not all at once, but in pieces, drips from the eaves, green pushing up through brown, warmth seeping into places long frozen. Inside the cabin, the babies napped soundly in their cradle, their breath soft and even. Clara sat near the door with a mending basket in her lap, stitching a torn sleeve. Elias was outside, splitting cedar logs with steady rhythm. She watched him through the open door, the way his shoulders moved with each strike calm, practiced, sure. When the sun dipped low and the firewood was stacked, he came in and set his axe by the door. He didn't look at her at first, only moved to the hearth, stirred the coals, added 2 fresh logs. Clara, sensing something in his silence, not the usual stillness, but a pause filled with weight, set her needle aside. "You ever going back?" she asked quietly. He turned, eyes unreadable. "To town? To people?" He shook his head once. "Ain't nothing there for me." Clara studied him. "There's something here, though." That stilled him. His fingers twitched against the mantel, and his gaze dropped to the flames. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, not from lack of use, but from memory clawing up through the walls he'd buried it behind. "Her name was Liza," he said, "my wife, and our girl Susanna. She was 4, smart as a whip, always sang when she was scared." He rubbed his thumb along the grain of the mantel, a motion as old as grief. "I was 3 days out, checking traps after a late snow. Left 'em with enough wood, enough food. Thought I'd be back before the storm turned. Wasn't." He paused. The fire popped, throwing a flicker across his face. Lightning hit a tree near the roof. Whole cabin caught before dawn. No one saw, no one helped. His voice broke for the first time in Clara's presence, though he did not cry. "I buried 'em both under the oak west of here. Built this place after. Been here near 10 years. Figured I'd done enough damage to the world." Clara swallowed hard, the sting of tears pressing behind her eyes. She rose, crossed the room, and stood near him, not touching, just there. "You didn't do that," she said gently. "The storm did." He looked at her then, really looked at her bruises, long faded, at the curve of Mercy's head resting on a pillow, at the mended sleeves of a shirt he'd worn for years and never noticed until she repaired it. "You saved me," she added, "and you saved them." Elias straightened, shoulders stiff. He nodded once, slowly, like settling something deep within himself. Then his voice came clear, quiet, and certain. "They need a father," he said. "I will be that. No poetry, no grand gesture, just a man reclaiming something he thought he'd lost forever." Clara's breath caught. She didn't answer with words. She simply took his hand, calloused, scarred, and trembling, and placed it gently over Mercy's chest as she slept, where her tiny heart beat strong and steady beneath his palm. The sun over Fetter's Hollow burned hotter as spring took full hold, but there was a chill in the wind that had nothing to do with weather. It came first as a whisper, trailing behind a peddler's wagon loaded with dry goods. Then it echoed through the pews of the little white church. By the time it reached the sheriff's office, it had taken on the sharp, metallic edge of threat. "She's alive," said a voice outside the door, low and certain. Deputy Roy Mayfield stood at the window, polishing the silver on his belt buckle as if he hadn't already heard. The words had found him before the sun rose that morning, carried by a farmhand who'd stopped for supplies up near the ridge. A woman, pale and thin, had come down to a creek with 3 babies in tow. A man with a beard like a bear's shadow had followed close behind, keeping watch like a hawk over his brood. Roy didn't flinch, didn't blink. "She was supposed to be dead," he muttered. The sheriff looked up from his desk, unease written plain across his face. "She was left for dead, Roy. That's different." Roy turned, eyes narrowing. "Don't split hairs with me." He strode across the room, boots loud on the worn wooden floor. His voice dropped low and tight. "She took them. My brother's name runs in their blood. That makes them Mayfields. I ain't letting some wild-eyed widow and a backwoods hermit raise what's rightfully ours." The sheriff opened his mouth, then closed it again. Roy's temper wasn't new, nor was his hunger for control. The town had learned to sidestep it, like a rattler sunning on a porch step. Still, there was a difference between scaring schoolboys and riding out for blood. "I'd think hard before going up there," the sheriff said. "Word is, she's found shelter with Elias Stone." That gave Roy pause. "The recluse?" The sheriff nodded. "The one they say buried his family up near the pass. Dangerous man." Roy sneered. "Dangerous? He's broken, hiding from the world like a mutt with its tail tucked. He won't stop me." Within hours, Roy had gathered 3 men, farmhands owed favors, and 1 old trapper with a grudge to settle. They rode out under the slanting light of late afternoon, guns loaded, expressions grim. The townsfolk watched them pass in silence, curtains drawn just enough to peek through. Some clutched rosaries, others whispered prayers not for Roy, but for the woman he hunted. Miss Alma Jackson stood on her porch, arms folded tight across her chest as the dust of the departing riders settled around her boots. Her jaw clenched. She had helped birth Clara's babies, though none but the Lord and Clara knew that. She had also seen the bruises, the fear etched into every inch of the young widow's face. And she had watched Roy Mayfield walk free time and again, his badge gleaming like a lie no one dared correct. As the last rider disappeared into the pines, Alma turned and stepped back inside. She reached for her shawl, her Bible, and her riding boots. Trouble had gone up the mountain. She would not let it come down again without a reckoning. The horses arrived, coated in sweat, their breath heavy in the warm spring air as Roy Mayfield and his 3 men dismounted in the square at Fetter's Hollow. They moved like men on a mission, boots heavy on dirt-packed streets, hands twitching near their holsters, eyes scanning each window, each porch, each passing face. Roy's jaw clenched as he stepped into the general store first, pushing open the door with the kind of force that demanded attention. Old Mr. Hemley looked up from behind the counter, the ledger in his hand, trembling just enough to betray him. Roy sauntered in, the spurs on his boots, singing low. "You seen a woman come through here?" he asked, voice smooth, like oil poured over gravel, dark hair, thin. Might have been carrying babies, 3 of them. Hemley didn't answer right away. He glanced at the young boy restocking flour sacks near the back, then back to Roy. "Plenty of women come through. Babies, too." Roy stepped closer. "I asked you about Clara Mayfield." Silence fell heavy. The boy stopped moving. Even the wind outside seemed to hush. "Can't say I have," Hemley replied at last, eyes steady now. "And if she did come through, I reckon she wasn't looking to be followed." Roy stared at him a long beat before knocking over a jar of licorice with one swift backhand. Glass shattered across the floor. "If you're lying, Hemley, I'll find out. Don't forget whose name's on half the deeds in this town." He stormed out, the others following. Their next stop was the post office, then the livery. At each place, they barked the same questions, knocked over what wouldn't answer, and left behind a thicker fog of fear than before. By midday, the whole town buzzed like a beehive rattled by a stick. On porches and in parlors, folks whispered. Was it true? Had Clara really survived that storm? Were the Mayfield boys going to start something no one could stop? At the edge of town, in a weathered clapboard cottage shaded by cottonwoods, Miss Alma Jackson laid a clean cloth across her kitchen table and placed a tin of warmed milk beside a wrapped parcel of biscuits. She moved slowly, deliberately, her hands never once shaking. But her eyes were sharp and watchful, fixed on the dust rising from the road beyond her window. She had heard Roy had returned, had heard, too, the stories spreading like smoke about a widow seen near the mountain, about a man guarding her like a bear over cubs. She knew Elias Stone by reputation and by instinct. A man who had once lost everything and now stood between the past and something still tender. Alma lit her lantern early that day. She packed a satchel with dried herbs, gauze, and a small pistol wrapped in a linen cloth. She penned a note and left it on the mantel. Gone to the ridge. Pray if you must. As evening drew its shadows over the town, Alma mounted her mare and turned her eyes toward the mountain. She knew Roy Mayfield wasn't looking to talk. He was riding with the heat of entitlement and the stink of unfinished cruelty. And if he reached Clara, if he laid hands on that girl or those babies, it wouldn't just be Elias Stone who'd rise to meet him. It would be her. And maybe, if the Lord still listened to the quiet prayers of women with open hearts and strong hands, it would be the town, too. The sun had barely crested over the eastern ridge when the thud of hooves reached Elias's ears. He was already chopping wood behind the cabin, axe mid-swing, when Thorn let out a low, growling bark. Elias straightened, eyes narrowing. Dust kicked up along the trail that wound out from the valley. 4 riders, dark silhouettes against the pale light, coming fast. He didn't move. He didn't call out. He set the axe down slowly, then walked to the porch and took his rifle from its mount on the beam. By the time the riders drew close, the barrel was across his forearm, casual but clear. Roy Mayfield reined in first, his horse breathing hard beneath him. He sat straight in the saddle, badge glinting on his chest, his eyes locked on Elias. The others hung back just a step, their hands resting near their pistols, but not yet drawn. Well, Roy said, voice carrying across the clearing. Didn't believe it at first, thought no one in their right mind would harbor a woman run mad with grief and theft. He spat to the side. But here you are, raising my brother's children like strays. Elias said nothing. He stood on the porch like a stone sentinel, rifle still in his grip, feet planted. Roy smirked and swung off his horse. Don't bother pretending you didn't know who she was, or what those babies are. They're Mayfields. Blood says so. Law backs it. Behind the cabin window, Clara pulled back the curtain just enough to see. Her heart pounded, but she didn't hesitate. She turned to the cradle and touched each child's head, then stepped outside, skirts rustling, chin high. They're not yours, Roy, she said, voice calm and clear. They never were. Roy turned, eyes narrowing. You got nerve, Clara. I'll give you that. Running off in the night like a thief. After all we did for you, you left me to die, she said. Beaten, bloodied, with 3 newborns in my arms. You think that's something a family does? Roy's face flushed. You shamed us. My brother's name deserved better than being dragged through the dirt with whispers of triplets and widow's madness. You lost your mind. No, she said, stepping closer to Elias without looking at him. I found it, right here, in this cabin, with these children, with a man who has more honor in one scarred hand than you do in your whole body. Roy took a step forward. Elias's rifle lifted, slow and deliberate. You'll want to think carefully, Elias said, voice gravel low and steady. Next step you take decides whether you walk back down this mountain. The men behind Roy shifted. None of them drew. Roy's hand hovered near his holster but didn't move. This isn't over, Roy said. I'll bring the law, judges, land claims. I'll bring the whole weight of the county down on you. Elias didn't flinch. Bring what you want, but you'll never take those children. Clara stepped closer, her fingers brushing Elias's sleeve. We're not afraid of you anymore, she said. Roy stared at them both, this woman he couldn't control, this man who'd come from nowhere and defied every whisper of town gossip. Then he turned without another word and mounted his horse. The others followed. None of them looked back. As the sound of hooves faded, the mountain grew quiet again. Elias lowered the rifle. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He looked at her then, and though he didn't smile, there was a glint in his eyes of steel. Yes, but also something warmer. The battle wasn't over, but they'd held the line. And from the cradle inside, a baby began to cry, not in fear but in hunger, sure and steady, like life daring to keep going. Miss Alma Jackson rode before first light, her shawl wrapped tight against the wind, her boots wet with dew. The mare beneath her moved quick and sure, as if it, too, understood the urgency. By the time the sun broke over the ridge, casting gold across the fields, she was halfway to Benson's Crossing, where Judge Lyle kept quarters above the bank. She had no time for tea or pleasantries. There was a woman on the mountain who had survived death, 3 children born into cruelty, and a man hardened by grief who had chosen, against all odds, to protect them. The judge listened, leaning forward as Alma recounted the truth that had grown wild behind the town's tidy gossip, She spoke of Clara's bruises, of the quiet way she had endured her husband's death and his family's scorn. She told of the night Clara disappeared, how everyone assumed she'd perished, and how not one man had ridden after her. Then she spoke of Elias Stone not as the monster of whispered legend, but as the man who opened his door to a near-dead stranger and nursed her and her children back to life with nothing but cedar and grit. Judge Lyle rubbed his jaw, clearly torn between the law on paper and the law that lived in a man's heart. Alma leaned in, her voice low and firm. If Roy Mayfield wants to invoke blood and property, then let him do so under the full light of truth. But I'll not sit quiet while a woman and her children are stolen again by the same hands that tried to bury them. By noon, she was back in Fetter's Hollow, not resting, but walking the dusty main road with purpose, first to the general store, then the blacksmith, then the church. At each place, she spoke not in gossip but in testimony. She told them how Elias had built a cradle from pine, how Clara had named each child with trembling lips, how those babies had smiled for the first time in that mountain cabin. She described Elias not as a threat, but as a man who'd buried his own and still found it in his broken heart to protect someone else's. Some folks looked skeptical, others embarrassed, but the telling planted seeds. Old Mr. Hemley, who once turned Clara away, muttered, "Didn't know she lived. Not really. Thought it was just wind whistling through the trees." He shook his head. "But if she's alive, and with those babes, Lord help us if we let Roy take her." At the schoolhouse, the teacher, Miss Avery, offered to gather supplies. At the mill, the foreman promised to keep his men ready should help be needed. One by one, those who had once turned their backs began to lean forward, uncertain but moved. Alma returned home late, the lantern in her window burning brighter than usual. She sat on her porch, hands folded over her Bible, and watched the townsfolk pass with fuller eyes. The mountain hadn't moved, but the people had, and soon they would be asked to choose not what was easy, but what was right. The church bell rang at noon, not for a sermon, but for judgment. Word had spread quickly there would be an emergency hearing, called by Judge Lyle himself. The pews filled faster than they ever did on Sundays. Farmers left their fields half-tilled, shopkeepers shut up early, and the children sat hushed beside mothers who clutched them close, unsure what lesson might be learned that day. At the front, a table had been placed before the altar, and behind it sat Judge Lyle, his brow furrowed, his gavel lying untouched beside a weathered law book. To his left stood Roy Mayfield, his badge polished, his posture stiff with confidence. On his right stood Elias Stone, broad-shouldered and silent, Clara just behind him with the 3 babies asleep in a wicker cradle at her feet. Roy spoke first. He paced before the pews with the swagger of a man certain of the crowd's loyalty. "My brother died, leaving behind a widow and what we later discovered 3 children. My family took her in, fed her, clothed her, but she turned on us, took those babies in the dead of night, disappeared into the wild like a madwoman. For months we thought her dead, until word came that she'd shacked up with this man." He pointed at Elias with theatrical disgust. "A known recluse, dangerous, no kin, no law. She's not well. And those children they are, Mayfields by blood, my family's blood. It's my duty to see they're raised right." Murmurs rose through the pews, some agreeing, others shifting uneasily. Clara stood then, trembling but steady. "You beat me," she said. "You and your mother. You called me wicked for birthing 3 at once. You told the doctor to let me die." Roy scoffed. "She's delusional. I walked into a snowstorm with nothing but faith and 3 crying babes," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. "And I found mercy in the one place I never expected it, in the home of a man you called a monster. But he fed us. He healed me. He stayed up every night to make sure my babies breathed through until morning. He's their father now, not by blood, but by every decent act a man can do." A silence settled thick and sharp. Then Elias reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded, yellowed letter. He handed it to Judge Lyle without a word. The judge unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the script. He read aloud, "I, Thomas Mayfield, in sound mind, do leave my holdings and land, including the estate at Crow Hollow, to my wife Clara Mayfield. should I not return from this winter's drive?" The judge paused, glancing at Roy. "It's signed, dated 2 days before he died, and witnessed." Whispers surged through the church like wind through brittle leaves. Roy's face drained of color. "That will was never filed," he hissed. "Because you hid it," Elias said, his voice deep and final. "Buried it. You wanted the land, not the family." Judge Lyle slammed the gavel down, a sound that cracked through the tension like thunder. "The court recognizes Clara Mayfield as rightful heir to the estate. Any further claim by Deputy Roy Mayfield is hereby revoked. And should he contest this ruling, he'll be facing criminal charges for obstruction and fraud." Gasps erupted. Roy stumbled back, his hand twitching near his hip, but Alma Jackson was already on her feet in the second row, eyes locked on him like iron. So were half the town. Roy lowered his hand. As the judge stood, the babies stirred in their cradle, and Mercy let out a soft cry, not in fear, but like a voice joining a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. Elias reached down, lifted her into his arms, and turned toward the light spilling in through the stained glass windows, where the town had finally begun to see clearly. When the judge rose from his seat behind the altar, the weight of the room shifted. No longer just a hearing, the gathering had become something deeper: penance, perhaps, or reckoning. Dust floated in sunbeams that streamed through the stained glass windows, painting streaks of color across the wooden floor where Clara stood, babies now cradled against her chest, and Elias stood beside her like a stone carved from the mountain itself. The gavel struck once more, sharp and final. "This court finds the last will and testament of Thomas Mayfield valid and binding," Judge Lyle declared, voice ringing through the church. "The land and all its holdings legally belong to Clara Mayfield. The children, being her natural-born kin, remain in her custody." He paused, looking directly at Roy Mayfield, whose mouth was pressed in a thin, twitching line. "As for the matter of obstruction, concealment of legal documents, and the attempted abduction of minors under false claim of guardianship, Roy Mayfield, you are hereby placed under arrest and existed." The words fell with the weight of thunder, and for a long moment no one moved. Then Sheriff Donnelly, who had hung back until now, stepped forward, hand on his revolver. He wasn't quick, but he was firm. "Roy," the sheriff said quietly, "hand over your weapon." Roy's face turned red, then pale. He looked to the townspeople, his people perhaps expecting someone to speak in his defense. No one did. Not the preacher, not the storekeeper, not the elders who had once nodded along with his boasts. Miss Alma stood with her arms crossed and her chin high, like a flame that refused to flicker. Even the men he'd ridden with avoided his eyes. "I was protecting the family name," Roy muttered bitterly, pulling the revolver from his holster with shaking fingers and setting it on the bench. "She was nothing when she came to us." Elias stepped forward then, slowly, deliberately. He stood at the front of the church, not as the man whispered about in taverns and warned of in bedtime tales, but as something far more undeniable, visible, present, and calm. His eyes met Roy's, not with hatred, but a quiet, immovable judgment. "She is more than you ever were," Elias said simply. The sheriff cuffed Roy's hands behind his back, and the sound of metal on bone echoed through the quiet. Roy didn't resist, but he walked stiffly, as though refusing to show the weight settling on his shoulders. As they escorted him out, the babies stirred. Elias turned toward the crowd and shifted the cradle slightly with his boot. Clara held Mercy and Hope, while little Elias looked up at the vaulted ceiling, as if studying the light. And then it happened, something small, but more powerful than any verdict. A slow clap from the back of the church, then another, and another, until the room filled with applause, not raucous or loud, but reverent. People rose to their feet, not for the judge, not even for Clara, but for Elias Stone, the man who had once been feared, now seen for what he truly was. A protector, a redeemer, a father. Elias didn't smile, but his shoulders, so long weighed down by grief, seemed to rise just slightly, as though a burden had finally been set down. He reached out and placed his hand gently on Clara's back. She looked up at him, eyes glistening, and gave a single nod. Outside, the bell rang again. Not for danger, not for mourning, but for justice finally arrived from the mountains. The trail to the cabin was no longer just a deer path worn through pine needles and snow. Wagon wheels left fresh tracks in the soil, and boot prints marked the passage of visitors, some cautious, some curious, most carrying something in their hands. Word of the hearing had traveled farther than Clara imagined. In the days that followed, people came not with judgment, but with gifts. A sack of cornmeal, a bolt of muslin, a box of children's books wrapped in twine. Miss Avery, the schoolteacher, arrived with a satchel full of slates and chalk, and a smile that didn't waver even as Thorne sniffed her boots with suspicion. "I thought they might want to learn," she said simply, nodding toward the cradle where Hope and Mercy kicked their feet in unison, while little Elias clutched a wooden horse that his namesake had carved just the night before. "And maybe," she added with a glance at Clara, "you might want to teach again when the time's right." Clara's breath caught at the offer. Once, long ago, before marriage, before pain, before the long walk into the woods, she had loved reading aloud to children, guiding small fingers across letters and watching eyes light up with understanding. She didn't answer right away, but her hands gripped the books Miss Avery had brought like they were treasures from another lifetime. Elias built another chair for the table, then another. He widened the hearth with fresh stones hauled from the creek. Each act of carpentry was quiet, precise, and somehow tender. He didn't say much about the visitors, but Clara noticed how he stayed outside longer when he heard a wagon on the ridge, as if waiting. When the Miller family brought fresh eggs, their youngest daughter crawled into Elias's lap without hesitation. He froze, unsure, until she placed a daisy in his palm and giggled. After that, he built her a little stool and placed it near the fire. The cabin that had once echoed with silence now thrummed with sound, gentle laughter, soft footsteps, the cooing of babies, and the rustle of pages being turned. The scent of cedar mixed with stew and bread, with soap and sweet grass. A line was strung behind the house for laundry, and the garden had sprouted green shoots bold enough to declare spring had truly come. Miss Alma visited often, bearing stories and advice, watching over Clara like a hawk with a fond streak. She brought cloth dolls for the girls and a carved whistle for the boy, and never left without drinking a cup of tea on the porch. "Don't let peace make you careless," she warned with a wink, "but let it find you all the same." Elias added a second window to the cabin, one that looked west, toward the path the sun took as it dipped behind the mountains. He placed a rocking chair near it, one Clara used each evening, a baby on her chest, her fingers brushing through soft tufts of hair. Sometimes she read aloud. Other times they all sat quietly, listening to birdsong, fire crackle, and the unmistakable sound of a home being lived in. The forest, once a place of exile, now stood like a wall of protection around them, and the cabin, once hidden, now welcomed every knock at its door. It was a still morning when Clara sat at the table, pen poised over the parchment the judge had sent by post. The ink bottle beside her caught the light spilling in from the window. Elias had built warm and golden, softening everything it touched. She held the quill with a steady hand, though her heart beat with something reverent and tender. The triplets slept nearby, Mercy curled on her side, Hope splayed with her arms over her head, and Elias Jr., snoring softly with his mouth wide open. The form was simple, its questions plain: mother's name, father's name, children's full names. She filled in the first lines easily. But when she reached the line that read, "Father," she paused only for breath, not for doubt. With care, she dipped the pen and wrote in strong, flowing script, "Elias Stone." She did not look to the door to see if he was watching. She didn't need to. He would come to know in his own time, in his own way, not through ceremony or speech, but through the quiet act of being chosen. Then came the children's names. She had whispered them to the wind during that long walk through snow, repeated them like scripture as she clutched them to her chest under the pines, called them through fever and near death and rebirth. But now they were being written into permanence. Mercy Liza Stone, for the grace that kept her breathing through the storm, and the name of a woman neither of them would forget. Hope Susanna Stone, for the light Clara had clung to in the darkest cold, and the little girl Elias had once carried only in dreams. Elias Thomas Stone, for the man who had opened his door and for the man who had once closed it. She finished with a flourish, dried the ink with a bit of cloth, and folded the document carefully. Miss Avery would take it into town and deliver it to the clerk's office herself. She had insisted. Outside, Elias sat on a low stool beneath the cedar tree, a boy in each arm, Elias Jr. in one, and young Samuel Miller perched beside him, watching intently as the old man drew his blade slowly along a piece of soft pine. He wasn't carving animals today, but letters, slow and deep. S for Samuel, E for Elias, H for Hope, though she would have to wait her turn until she was steady enough to hold the blade herself. Clara stepped out with her journal in hand and sat on the porch. She had begun writing down what had happened at first for herself, then for the children, but lately the words felt bigger than that. Not a record of sorrow, but a testament of survival. A tale of how they had found each other not in a time of peace, but in the wreckage of fear and loss. A tale where names mattered because they were chosen, not inherited. She titled the pages plainly, "The Garden in the Snow, A Family's Beginning," and while she wrote, Elias guided the small hands beside him, not with instruction, but with quiet encouragement. The boy grinned as the shavings curled from the wood and fell into the grass like scattered petals. Mercy laughed from the blanket, and Hope clapped her hands in delight. No one spoke of the past. But everything they did now was a kind of answer to it, a declaration written not in ink or stone, but in cradle-built futures, in the shape of tiny letters carved into wood, and in the soft sound of a pen scratching down a story that once had almost never been. The snow was long gone now, melted into the thirsty earth that drank it down and answered with life. The cabin, once a solitary silhouette in the wilderness, now stood at the edge of a clearing brimming with green. Shoots of beans reached for twine like children reaching for steady hands. The carrots had taken root deep and firm. Squash blossoms had opened their bright yellow mouths to the morning sun, and just beyond the first neat rows, more soil had been turned, more seeds scattered by more than Clara's hand. The town had come slowly at first. A few brought tools, others brought seeds. Then came the children, giggling with baskets and bare feet, helping Clara pull weeds and tasting strawberries before they'd ripened. What had begun as a widow's desperate act of survival became something else entirely, a place of gathering, of growth, a garden born from hardship, now tended with hope. Miss Alma knelt beside Clara one morning, both of them wrist-deep in soil. They worked side by side, planting rows of sunflowers along the edge of the garden, like sentries. "I've spoken to the school board," Alma said as she pressed a seed into the earth. "They've agreed to let me build a satellite classroom up here, just a one-room place, for the little ones, save the walk into town once winter hits." Clara looked up, blinking at her. "Here?" Alma nodded. "Right here. The world comes knocking eventually. Best to greet it on your own porch." That same afternoon, Elias cleared a patch of land near the edge of the woods, hammer and saw in hand. He didn't say much when Alma handed him the plans, just took them with a quiet nod and began to work. The walls went up within days, simple, sturdy, nothing fancy. But like everything Elias built, it was made to last. Hope toddled behind him, carrying small nails in her apron. Mercy helped gather kindling for the new school stove. Elias Jr. tried to lift a hammer nearly half his weight. Elias watched them all with a quietness that no longer resembled distance, but wonder. And one evening, as Clara stood beside the garden fence brushing dirt from her palms, she caught a glimpse of something she hadn't yet seen. Elias, sitting on the schoolhouse steps with a baby in each arm, and a smile breaking across his face. Not a twitch or a smirk, not one of those small, softening gestures he sometimes gave, but a full, unguarded smile, stretching across the beard and the years and the sorrow that had lived inside him too long. She held her breath, didn't call attention to it, just watched, because that smile wasn't for show. It wasn't for the town. It was for the moment, for the laughter echoing through the clearing, for the smell of earth and growing things, for the sound of children who bore his name not by blood, but by love. The garden had bloomed, yes, but so had he. And as the sun slipped behind the trees, painting the sky in orange and lavender, Clara walked up the cabin steps, journal in hand, and sat beside the man who had once answered the world with silence and was now learning to answer it with joy. The sky that morning was wide and blue, the kind of blue that felt earned after a long winter. A breeze moved gently through the meadow, stirring the tall grass and bending the wildflowers just enough to make them dance. Near the cabin, under the shade of the big oak, the townsfolk had begun to gather blankets laid out, baskets filled with cornbread and preserves, roast chicken wrapped in cloth, pies set carefully in tins. There was laughter, the kind that came easy now. Children ran barefoot between the trees, teachers chatted with farmers, and Miss Alma sat proudly beneath a patchwork umbrella with a hymn book resting on her lap, though she had no plans to sing. Clara stood at the garden's edge, her hair braided back, a soft cotton dress fluttering at her knees. She held Mercy in one arm, while Hope clung to her skirt, curious eyes tracking the movement of butterflies above the lettuce rows. The wind carried the scent of fresh bread and soil and lilacs. And near the porch, seated on the newly built swing, Elias held the smallest of the three, Elias Jr., cradled in his arms. The boy fussed at first, rubbing his fists into his eyes, but Elias rocked gently, humming something low and tuneless that only the child could hear. The swing creaked in rhythm, back and forth, a lullaby made of wood and patience. Clara turned to look at them then, and for a moment she did not speak. She just watched the man who had once lived among ghosts, who had once built walls not just around his home, but around his soul. His shoulders, once hunched in grief, now sat broad and relaxed. His hands, once used to carve wood in silence, now supported life with quiet strength. He looked down at the child in his arms, and then up at her, and then he said it, "I will be their father." He didn't say it loudly. There was no speech, no ceremony. Just those 6 words, spoken like an oath, like a truth that had taken root over seasons and storms and sleepless nights. Clara's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She nodded once, slow and sure, and walked to him. She sat beside him on the swing, Mercy nestled between them, Hope climbing into her lap, and the cradle of this strange and beautiful family came to rest in that gentle sway. Behind them, the town began to sing. Nothing formal, just a few voices rising into a folk tune passed down through generations. The song spoke of home, of land tilled by hard hands, of hearts that refused to give up. Someone passed around plates, someone else lifted a fiddle. The picnic unfolded like the last page of a well-worn book, familiar, comforting, true. The camera pulled back slowly, capturing the whole clearing now. The garden in full bloom, the schoolhouse freshly painted, the townsfolk gathered in easy communion, the cabin with its door wide open. Birdsong filled the air, mingling with laughter, with the hum of bees, with the soft hush of wind through pine. And as the screen faded to the colors of dusk, a narrator's voice rose with quiet warmth. Stories like these remind us that family is not made by blood, but by love, courage, and choosing to stand for what is right. If these are your values too, then you are already part of this story. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us what still matters most.